Hello and welcome to Dateline London. South Africa prepares for a week of events to commemorate the life of Nelson Mandela. We'll look at his legacy and the future of the country. Also, how strong is the British economy? Is the Chancellor right to claim that his plan is working? My guests today are Polly Toynbee of The Guardian, Stephanie Baker from Bloomberg, Tererai Karimakawenda from SW Radio Africa, and Heather Walker, the editor of thesouthafrican.com. Welcome to you all, and thanks very much for joining us. Heather, if I can start with you, we've heard a lot over the last few days about Nelson Mandela's extraordinary life and achievements. What sort of state do you think he does leave South Africa in now?
I think you could look at it in two ways. I think people are asking what is his legacy, and people are really searching and questioning. But on one hand, his legacy is the country itself, is the people, is the institutions that he built, and the kind of reconciliation that he developed in South Africans. I mean, we are a changed country. 20 years after democracy, we are a different place, and you can see this in the way that people relate to each other. But then on the other hand, there's a sort of a slightly sadder one, in that a lot of people are questioning where the country is going. 20 years after democracy, have we really changed enough? Has the economy moved on enough? And are the current leaders living up to Mandela's values of equality and rights for all? And you see that the legacy of Mandela might be kind of in a slightly fragile state, as some people would argue.
Tererai, do you think that's right?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. If you look at the promise that Mandela brought, the hope that people had when he came out of prison, one of the things that were promised was just basic water and electricity to everyone, and you still have millions of people in South Africa who don't have those basics. And I think Mandela has been let down by the people that followed him. I think he had the right idea, and I think he stepped down at the right time, did the right thing, because many African leaders, as you know, don't want to step down, and you literally have to force them from power. But he did the right thing, but the people after him, I think, did not follow those ideals, and I think they could have done a lot more to change the lives of poor South Africans.
Yeah, because we know that unemployment is around 25%. There's still a big gulf between the incomes of the black and white communities.
Yes, I mean, income inequality in South Africa actually has widened since apartheid. And I think that's going to be a real battleground going forward as people, struggle for the heart of the ANC and how it develops the economy going forward. In the past year and a half, there's been a series of wildcat strikes across mines in South Africa, where unions are demanding, in some cases, doubling of wages. It's been met by a very deadly response by the police. I think they haven't handled it well at all. Now you have unions threatening to leave the ANC because they disagree with government policy. And so I think there's a lot of question marks as to how South Africa goes forward and moves that Mandela legacy, perhaps remembers what he wanted to do, which was equality of opportunity for everyone. And I think they've fallen short of that. You see his economic legacy unraveling a bit.
Yes, I mean, there's been a huge amount spoken about how much he did achieve. Do you think that in the understandable immediate aftermath of his death, perhaps some of the wider problems have been overlooked?
I think so. I suppose it's not really a day or a week for looking at his weaknesses or at the things that he couldn't achieve. After all, you think of the heavy lifting required and looking at how amazing it was what he did achieve. And I think that remains the most remarkable thing about him, despite everything that you say. But I've been looking at the extraordinary British reaction, the sheer, utter hypocrisy of the British right wing and the British press. You have pages and pages of the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the papers who absolutely supported apartheid at the time. I was amongst the demonstrators outside South Africa House, very often a member of the anti-apartheid movement. I worked in what was then Rhodesia for Amnesty International in one of the Ian Smith years. And the rewriting of history of the British government, particularly British Conservatives' role in all of this, they absolutely supported apartheid. And now suddenly you're getting David Cameron saying, weeping and saying how wonderful he was. David Cameron himself visited South Africa, expenses paid, 1989, expenses paid by a lobbying group lobbying against sanctions. We get these crocodile tears and it sticks in my throat.
Yeah, no, what's been really interesting for me is listening to these stories. I was listening to talk radio all night the other night, listening to the stories that ordinary people were telling about those demonstrations and sit-ins and the things that people did, just ordinary white people who supported, the movement and wanted him to be freed from jail. Really lovely stories about how I brought my daughter and we stayed there all night, and money that was raised by youth clubs. That's when you really see the legacy that Nelson Mandela is leaving. I think when you look at the relationships that have developed over the years. I was listening to a woman who said she was married to a Jamaican, and this is how she got to know about Nelson Mandela, because as a white person she had never had any black friends before that. When she married this Jamaican, he brought this other aspect to her life that led her then to Nelson Mandela and raising funds. So that kind of legacy, bringing people together, black and white, I think is the strongest legacy that
But
is
looking
leaving.
at our coverage now, you'd think that was a big part of where Britain was at. It was a small beleaguered group with the police treating the demonstrators as if they were lefty lunatics.
That people would spit on you at some of these demonstrations.
Absolutely, and still a great exodus of right-wing white Brits to South Africa for a better life. You have lots of servants and they proved apartheid and all of that. So the cultural rewriting that's going on now is kind of dangerous.
And of course South Africa does now have the advantage as a result of that. It's no longer a pariah state, there's quite a bit of foreign investment. But we've got these big elections coming up and already some criticism of the current ANC leadership. How do you think that's going to pan out, Heather?
Well, we know that the ANC is certainly losing support. We don't know quite how it's going to pan out by the time the election comes. It might be that because it's 20 years, as we celebrate next year, it's hard to believe, but we'll be celebrating 20 years of democracy. And so that will obviously be a watershed moment in our country. And the elections come at a time when, as Stephanie mentioned, there are these extreme economic problems with the mines and the unions, and there's a rift between the unions and the ANC. And that's been traditionally one of their main strongholds is the unions. So how they might break away could influence the election quite strongly, as well as obviously all the new parties that are coming forward. A lot of people could have written Julius Malema off a few months ago, but he's back now. He's got a new political party. We've got Dr. Mampela Rampele with the party Agang SA. All sorts of new pieces coming up, new parties that are coming up, and although they're not going to win a huge amount of the vote, certainly the first time around, we know that the ANC will be looking at those parties, and of course also the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, which is growing in popularity in many communities.
And of course South Africa is now seen as quite an important player, one of the BRIC emerging economies in the world, and that economic future for the country is hugely important, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but on the other hand, it's not a China or an India. It hasn't experienced the kind of rapid economic growth that we've seen some of the BRIC countries experience. And that's partly because, the economic legacy that Mandela left them was, he played a huge role in stabilizing the economy. I think people forget how bad South Africa was at the time that he took over as president. They had a massive budget deficit. Capital was fleeing the country. He really played a very strong stabilizing force and set up the conditions for economic growth for 15 years until 2008 when the financial crisis hit. And now I think it ought to be growing faster. And I think the challenge is how do they strike the balance between working conditions and pay. I think that's going to be a real focus going forward, and attract international investment at the same time. And how to strike that balance in a very politically tricky time period is going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, and Tererai, because South Africa is a hugely important player in that whole region.
Well, yeah, in the SADC region, the Southern African Development Community, it's definitely the most important player right now. If you remember, South Africa was appointed the facilitators in terms of the negotiations in Zimbabwe. When we had elections and we had problems there, Thabo Mbeki was the facilitator who was negotiating between the MDC and Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF. But from that perspective, Zimbabweans had huge respect for Nelson Mandela, and many just wished that he had said something about the situation in Zimbabwe, particularly when we had violent elections and people were being brutalized, and we had a president who's been in power for 30 years is refusing to leave. Zimbabweans had so much respect for Mandela, they just wanted just a word, verbal criticism, or just pointing to the facts about the situation next door. It was a very glaring absence or deafening silence, if you may. But he was very, very, very well respected in Zimbabwe.
And Stephanie, just briefly, as we look at South Africa's future in that region, do you think that the markets are going to look positively on its future without Nelson Mandela there? Even obviously some time after he'd left power, but he was still there as this presence for the nation, wasn't he?
Well, I think that's really going to depend on the outcome of the elections and what happens to the ANC. If it turns into a much messier political situation, if you see the unions breaking off from the ANC, I think it's going to add to some instability. And I think they really need to focus on a broad agreement on wages to placate the unions and to stabilize. The mining industry is a huge part of South Africa's economy, and they need to find a solution that works long term.
Polly, a final thought on South Africa's future and how we'll view it?
Well, South Africa has always been the great, emblem of hope for the rest of Africa, and if it can't resolve its inequality problem, it looks pretty grim. After all, the gap in wages is so enormous between top and bottom that there has to be some way of showing that you can have more democratic, in the sense of fairer distribution of wealth, I'd have thought, as the way forward for Africa.
Tererai, would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I also just wanted to add, though, that it's an important time, I think, to look back at what all this meant, what apartheid was really, and what it meant to people. The separation of people, that you had classes of people where the Asians and Africans were here and the whites were there, and to revisit that, and if you have children or whatever, to really look at what Mandela's fight was all about, because that fight, that struggle has produced many important people, including your Martin Luther Kings and your Gandhis. They were all fighting for the same thing, which is equality and justice and a good life for all people. And I think it's a good time to revisit that.
Yes, a whole new focus on that after Nelson Mandela's death.
Absolutely.
And we must move on now, because in Britain this week, the Chancellor George Osborne gave his autumn statement, an update on the state of the country's economy. He trumpeted the fastest growth in the developed world, with better forecasts than he predicted in March. But his opposite number, Ed Balls, accused him of breathtaking complacency and a cost of living crisis leaving families far worse off. So who's right? Stephanie, I know that you watch these matters very closely. Did you think that the Chancellor was right to make all those rather confident claims on Thursday?
Well, it's remarkable how quickly the situation has changed in just 6 months. I mean, back in March, you had the IMF criticizing Osborne for not doing enough to kickstart the UK economy. You had Britain being downgraded by Moody's, its credit rating downgraded. I think it tells you a little bit about how difficult it is to predict these things, and that the economic forecasting has not been very good. The numbers don't lie. There is a recovery going on. Construction and services have rebounded. I think the issue is that it's not a very balanced recovery. I think it's being driven by consumer demand and credit as opposed to investment or exports. And that's partly because Europe is still in the doldrums, and Europe is the UK's largest trading partner. I thought, people viewed this as a very political statement by Osborne, that he is staking his economic stewardship at the center of the next election. And I think that's going to get very tricky going forward, because he was claiming that his austerity plan worked and that had resulted in economic growth. Now, a lot of economists look at that and think, well, that might be a bit of a stretch. I mean, the Bank of England has kept interest rates at historic lows for 5 years, has embarked on unprecedented quantitative easing, and I think that's really taking hold, and that is resulting in some of the economic growth. And the real issue is, how do you unravel this without killing the economy? The Bank of England now is saying it won't raise interest rates until unemployment falls below 7%. The forecasts that were released recently are showing that that's probably going to happen end of 2014, early 2015, which means you're going to have a hike in interest rates for the first time in 6 years, right before a general election, which is going to be very interesting.
You won't. Mark Carney has not been put there by George Osborne in order to raise interest rates just before the next election. I'm willing to have a substantial bet with you that he won't. And if Labour were to win the next election, they're going to face the rising of interest rates. This is a very political business. The idea that interest rates are totally independent from anything to do with government, wouldn't you doubt it, really?
Heather, of course, George Osborne, part of his job was to try to make sure that he maintains international confidence. Do you think that he succeeded there?
I think he has, to a certain extent. Britain is well regarded internationally in many spheres, and I don't think compared to South Africa, it's certainly Britain certainly has much higher debt than South Africa, which is hard to believe. But financially, I think he has certainly.
Well, it just seems to me that that they're playing around with figures, and there's never any agreement between economic experts as to what's true and what's not true. You have the IMF saying one thing and Osborne saying another thing.
You can always look at a different set of figures, can't you?
He's added another year to his austerity plan, which shows literally that he was way off, and he's trying to find $25 billion in cuts, welfare cuts. That is a lot of money. I mean, they've already cut, and a lot of people are suffering. If you listen to what people say on the buses and on the trains, they're still feeling this austerity quite seriously. And to say that there's more coming, I can't even imagine how many people are going to make it.
And Polly, the growth forecasts are up compared to what George Osborne was telling us 6 months ago, but they're still not back up where he hoped he'd be when this government came into power.
No, they're miles off. When he said he'd be back in balance by 2015. I mean, not a chance. And he says now, and as Tererai said, he's pushed forward his target. I think what was interesting about this is that you had, a cautious but quite ebullient statement from the Chancellor, and the next day, read the front page of the Financial Times. The OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which Osborne himself put in place, independent body, the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the most, who is the arbiter of all of these things, totally independent. Bucket loads of cold water on it, really, saying, this is partly rising faster than other people because it went further and deeper and lasted longer. Also saying, as you were saying, that this is house prices and credit, mostly. It's the old familiar British disease bubble. There's a bit of construction looks as if it's come up fast because it was on its knees. But if you look at the actual building going on, it's still absolutely minimal. So there are a lot of questions still. It's much better to be where we are than where we were 6 months ago. But then you look at the cuts, that his austerity has hardly begun. The IFS, OBR saying, after the next election, bigger cuts than we have ever had, and actually all of them saying, you know what, you can't do this. The bins will not be collected at the rate that he's penciled in.
And to talk of tax rises, again, at a time when, people are already complaining about the train fares have gone up, fuel has gone up, I mean, it's just tax rises.
It's probably going to be necessary because either you run a huge deficit, which when interest rates goes up will be very expensive, or else you have these kinds of cuts that are really, I'd have thought, politically impossible. So in the end, you've got to pay for it.
They're talking about cutting, government departments even further. Government. I live in a neighborhood where, for example, I look at the economy basically because I'm not an economic expert. I see just how it affects people around me. The library closed in the area where I lived, and the council took the books and the furniture and put them in storage. Now, that's a contract that they're paying monthly. So the residents, the local residents, took over the library, and we're now running it. We've filled it up with books, and now the council is giving us back that furniture which they took out. And so
well,
a lot of this
it's obviously been a good spur for community action. Then,
but anyway, just to make the point that they're not going to cut government spending much more than they already have, and that this austerity is starting to be felt by people.
All
I can't
depends
imagine
who wins the next election. This is the big dividing line. The Conservatives say they want to get the size of government down permanently and forever to way below what we've been traditionally used to.
But despite that fact that a lot of local services are being cut, and we've had Ed Balls talking endlessly about the cost of living, how people are being squeezed because their wages aren't going up as quickly as the prices are rising, and yet by and large, from all the polls, people seem to be wanting to stick with George Osborne's recipe.
Well, Labour is leading in the polls still. It's true that Osborne's ratings as a steward of the economy have risen recently, which is not surprising given the economic growth we've seen. But I mean, I agree, Polly. A lot of the cuts are back-ended for after the election, and it will be, it's really unclear. Even if the Conservatives win the next election, will they be able to carry that off? Forecasting that far into the future, as we've seen from just the past 6 months, is incredibly difficult. But the fact of the matter is, even with these cuts, net public debt is going to peak at £1.5 trillion. I mean, that is astonishing, and just the servicing of that debt is enormous. So something has to give somewhere, and I think they don't want to do too much before the next election. So it's 2016 is going to be a very tricky year.
And Heather, I mean, Britain's doing better than some of the other Eurozone countries, but we're not alone in still struggling to emerge from this global financial crisis.
Certainly not. I mean, other countries have survived much better, notably places like Australia, which are doing incredibly well and barely sort of saw a recession. But I think Britain is still kind of, in Europe, is one of the stronger countries. And I suppose we can thank those who are responsible for our financial management in some ways.
Tererai, given what you were talking about and this kind of bleak recipe which George Osborne has set out, are you surprised that there hasn't been more of a backlash against it?
Yeah, no, I'm very surprised because when you hear what people say just in normal everyday life, they're quite angry at government in general for, what they feel has become a very difficult life. It just seems that everything keeps going up, and the one thing that hasn't gone up is their salaries. So yeah, I'm very surprised that there hasn't been a backlash, and I'm very surprised, frankly, that there aren't more demonstrations and more public outbursts about this.
And probably perhaps surprised that Ed Balls doesn't seem to be winning over the public as much as he would like. He certainly seemed to struggle on Thursday.
He had a bad performance, but then I think it was bad both in content and in delivery. But the delivery, I think we film our Parliament in a very peculiar way that you do not see or hear the full force of the barrack of sound, that if you're standing where he was standing, you cannot hear yourself speak.
His side weren't very happy,
and
though, were they?
They weren't very happy, and it wasn't a good performance. I think the more serious critique, though, is that he hasn't decided how to grasp the enormity of what's planned for after the election. So what's Labour going to say? All right, they've said they'll stick to the envelope, though they'd move things within it in the first year. But they have to say, I think they'll have to be honest and say, I'm sorry, either we follow through these cuts, and this is what they will mean for health, for schools, for roads, for parks, for everything. Libraries no more, swimming pools no more, or we're going to have to pay for it. Taxes will have to rise. Whether you can win an election by being that honest, I don't know. But I think in this case of such extremity of what the Tories are planning, that's their only course. Honesty is the only hope.
And Stephanie, just briefly, that does seem to be where David Cameron and George Osborne are at the moment. They seem to be basing their whole approach as saying, stick with us because at least we're on the right course. Well,
I think the trust in George Osborne in managing the economy is higher than Ed Balls. I mean, he has not articulated a coherent response, and I think the coalition government has really succeeded in putting Labour on a back foot. For instance, they're trying to to pass this charter with parliamentary approval, getting everyone to commit to capping the net amount of public debt. So how is Labour going to respond to that without putting themselves in a tricky situation after the elections should they win? They don't really have a coherent response that their plan is better.
Okay.
And until they get there, they're, I think it's going to be difficult.
We're going to have to leave it there. This debate
behind on
will
the economy.
continue right up till the general election, but thank you all, because we have to leave it here. That's it for Dateline for this week. You can also comment on the programme on Twitter at Carole Walker CW using the hashtag Dateline London. We're back at the same time next week. Goodbye.